tardes.
Oh, look at you speaking French.
Yeah.
How are you? How are you?
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you as well. And it does feel like a Happy New Year.
Yeah, first recording of 2023.
And I feel so much better than I did the last time we recorded.
Yeah, it's been a rough one, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think our last recording was actually the Pale Man, and we were both looking exactly like the Pale Man.
We were the palest of pale men, yes. Yes, it was not good, really. Yes.
No.
But we're recovered, we're better, yes.
And we're doing something very different today.
Very, very different.
We in our failed attempt to try and create the catchphrase, so what have we been reading this week? Which we thought by now that people would be shouting that at us in Sainsbury's. Right.
That's not what they shouted at me.
It's not happened. No,
the shouts are completely different at me.
You still get the abuse.
Do you know, once I was walking through Sainsbury's, and this is completely off tangent, but I was walking through Sainsbury's and I sneezed. And it was a really, really loud sneeze. And I wasn't doing it for effect. It was just a massive sneeze that came out. And this bloke came up to me and said, "That's the loudest sneeze I've ever heard. I want to shake your hand." And I thought, you don't want to shake my hand at the moment because... Yeah, I want to shake your hand. Yeah, bless him. Yeah.
No. Last time I was in Sainsbury's, I was chucked out for sticking googly eyes to the magazines.
They do that, yes.
Yeah, they don't. No sense of humour.
No. It's criminal, really.
And Johnny Depp looked brilliant on the front of Empire magazine with a pair of googly eyes.
So yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. Then you were saying something different.
It's what we're doing. Yeah, we're doing something different because see what happens is I, as you know, very obsessed with the creative process, not just in writing. That just happens to be the one I can do, but also in filmmaking and music making and art, drawing, painting, anything to do with the creative process. I'm really quite obsessed with. And I watch these little videos sometimes where you get drawers, people that can actually draw, do really talented things with pencils.
Right.
And they just sit there live and just sit there doodling. People watch them doodle and you see the creative mind go ahead. You see how they construct a picture on screen. And I thought, I've never seen anyone do that as writing, because to be perfectly honest with you, to sit there and just look at a blank screen on Word for half an hour, type the word fuck 5 times, then piss off and get a whiskey, is not something that I think would make interesting viewing. So I
watch every night.
What is that? The reflection coming back from your screen whilst you're sat there in front of that blank page in front of Word?
Pretty much, yes.
So I thought we would spend our time here today. I've got 6 urban legends written down, which are urban legends that come from the list of urban legends found on Wikipedia. I've written 6 down at random. I've attributed them random numbers from 1 to 6. I believe you have cards from 1 to 6.
I have cards, yes.
If you could display those there you go. And could you display showing that they are different numbers on them? There you go. See, a bit like a magic trick here. And what he's going to do is just going to give him a bit of a shuffle. And then, Ash, I'm going to ask you to pick one of those numbers at random. And whatever that number is, whatever it goes to here, will be the urban legend that will be our starting point for a creative discussion to create a brand new story.
Perfect.
Okay. So the idea is to show how you can take something as simple as what you're going to hear as the urban legend on here, because I'll read the headline, read what it's about, and then we'll start discussing that and see if we can weave it into some sort of modern tale. Okay.
Right.
So Ash, I'm going to ask you, I'm not going to try and start some sort of catchphrase for this one, but I'm going to ask you to pick a number, draw a card, any card. We got the number 2. There you go. It's the number 2. And on my list, the number 2, and I'm really pleased, this one actually, just to show you that they are all different numbers. That's the writing down there. And you can see number 2, which is about here, actually says Green Children of Woolpit.
Oh, God. And before we go on to the Green Children of Woolpit, what was that fantastic looking notebook that you'd got there, Colin?
Oh, this fantastic looking notebook. You recognise the pages. This fantastic. We might as well do this. This fantastic is the Horror Writer's Notebook. Okay, which again, as most of the stuff that I usually do, started off as a little bit of a joke and ended up being a really fantastic product. I thought it'd be funny to write a notebook. What I've actually ended up with is me, myself, and Mr. Dr. Ashley Lister have written. I'll just show you there. You can see the corner here. See here, little prompts. So this is a whole book of note pages, blank note pages, but in the bottom corner of each double page is a prompt to help you come up with ideas for writing. And they're all horror-based prompts, like you find out your scientist mum made you out of reclaimed body parts. Starting point. A bit like what we're doing here with the urban legends. So that's in that one. Available on Amazon to buy and purchase, the Horror Writer's Notebook.
Awesome stuff. So we're looking at the Green Children of Woolpit.
Yes, the Green Children of Woolpit. Would you like to know a bit more about the Green Children of Woolpit?
Are they one from about 1365? And we're sort of like looking at the original Little Green Men. But yeah, no, tell me more.
Sort of. The Green Children of Woolpit were two children with unusual skin colour who repeatedly appeared in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, sometime in the 12th century, perhaps during the reign of King Stephen.
Right.
Which I thought was very interesting, because King Stephen could also be Stephen King. So that's the one that we're going to discuss. Just to let you know, the other ones were the 27 Club, which is the urban legend of all the famous artists and musicians that all died at the age of 27.
Right.
Goat Man, which is a bit self-explanatory, but it's a folklore legend that describes a creature resembling part goat, part human. Pretty much comes from Maryland in America. Then I had the Robert Johnson Crossroads legend, which is going down to the crossroads to sell your soul to the devil in return for being very talented about something. There's the Walt Disney in a cryo chamber legend, which I just thought would be interesting from a story point of view. And then there's another one. Have you heard of Polybus? Or Polybius?
I'm not sure.
Kind of stems back to the 1980s. Got real traction in the early 2000s. It's a legendary computer game. It now exists because other people have written it. But in the 1980s, it was the legendary computer game that
was
could...
it around Pink Floyd?
Well, No, yeah. It was... Polybius was supposed to be a legendary computer game that nobody knew the story, but it would either drive you mad...
Right.
Or it would cause instant death, a bit like Ring. If somebody gave it you and you played it, 7 days after you played it, you would die. So it was a modernization of an old sort of like chain letter idea.
All right. But instead of any of those really exciting ones, we're stuck with the Shitty Green Children of Woolpit.
Shitty Green Children of Woolpit. There you go. That's what random numbers do for you.
Tell me about them. What's the urban legend about them? Just that they had a dodgy skin colour, or
just and they used to appear. They had no real. They weren't related to anyone. There doesn't seem to be. But let's get into this then. And so the first thing that we're going to do is just research it a bit more.
I mean, I've got to say, full disclosure, I actually used the Green Children of Woolpit as part of K.
Did you?
Yeah, there's a reference to them. I think it's in one of the podcast chapters, and the whole, probably in chapter 3, the whole notion is that they're that they are potentially the first little green men that we have when we talk about little green men.
Right. Okay. Well, do you want to continue with that one, or do you want to pick another number?
Yeah, let's continue with this. Let's see what direction we can take it.
Let's see if it goes in another direction. So yeah, so that was your thing there. I've got the story here as at harvest time one day during the reign of King Stephen, according to William of Newborough, the villagers of Woolpit discovered 2 children, a brother and sister, beside one of the wolf pits. That gave the village its name. Oh, is
it a wolf pit or a wool pit?
Well, it says it's the Green Children of Woolpit, but that just says it's a wolf pit.
Right. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. This is just a story. But carry on.
Yep.
Their skin was green. They spoke in an unknown language, and their clothing was unfamiliar. Ralph of Coggers Hall reports that the children were taken to the home of Richard Decane. Calne? Ralph and William agreed that the pair refused all food for several days until they came across some raw broad beans, which they consumed eagerly. The children gradually adapted to normal food and in time lost their green colour. It was decided to baptise the children, but the boy, who appeared to be younger of the two, was sickly and died before or soon after the baptism. After learning to speak English, the children, Ralph says, just the surviving girl, explained that they came from a land where the sun never shone, like the pines, and the light was like twilight. William says the girl called their home St. Martin's Land. Ralph adds that everything there was green. According to William, the children were unable to account for their arrival in Woolpit. They had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud noise. According to William, it was like the sound of the bells of Bury St. Edmund's Abbey, and suddenly found themselves by the wolf pit where they were found. Ralph says that they had become lost when they followed the cattle into a cave and after being guided by the sound of the bells eventually emerged into our lands. So that's the story. That two children just found from nowhere, just turned up, couldn't speak English, was taught to speak English, didn't eat our food, then ate our food, went from green to white, or whatever colour they are in Suffolk.
Right. So with this one, it sounds almost as though the urban legend is trying to suggest that we've got some sort of matter transference, some sort of either interdimensional or teleportational thing that's happening. Where these people have been taken from the land of the green people into Suffolk.
Yes.
Which, narratively speaking, that's there's some author, and there's dispute as to who actually said it, who said that there were only two stories. One is a stranger comes to town, and the other is somebody leaves town, which is basically both of those stories, but from different perspectives. So what we've got there is those two stories, depending on which perspective you want it to be, whether it's strangers coming to town or somebody going to a town that's strange to them.
It's a funny one, that, isn't it? The idea that, so your basic narrative drives are alien in a new land, isn't it?
Yeah.
No matter whichever perspective you look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, which I kind of like that. I think that's an exciting idea. There's a lot of things here that are sort of like setting alarm bells for me as bland points, as things that, wouldn't want to. I mean, for a start, child protagonists.
Yeah.
I'm not very, very big on children, just because they bore me. That makes me sound like a horrible person, doesn't it?
No.
But yeah. So yeah, I want them to have more power than just sort of like changing skin color for this story.
Well, this is the whole thing, isn't it? Is that, this is now an urban legend, and like you said, goes back to like the 13th century, which is an awfully long time ago. I mean, the Babes in the Wood story is like 1800s, and this story's obviously been retold. Then you're looking at probably like 1940s for the same kind of story to then turn into Superman, which is the same idea, that you have children that turn up that are lost and are taken on by a surrogate parent who then fosters them and teaches them our ways, and sort of like starts turning them into sort of like members of this particular society. So those alignments are always there as that kind of sort of classic idea of something vulnerable being taken into the home and, of a childless couple usually as well is how it works. But in this one, it doesn't seem to have any superpowers that goes on. It just seems to be an alien land. But you think going back to the 13th century, just coming from a land where everything was green and twilight and no lights, just living, which sounds very much like living in a cave, to be perfectly honest with you. It sounds almost like a troglodyte existence. Would be strange and folktale and magical enough for people back in the 13th century, where nowadays, we might need to give them more superpowers. I remember reading a book once, just that was it. I remember reading a book once.
Was it a Tuesday?
Don't know, I was too busy reading.
All right.
No, it was called, oh God, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's very difficult to find, and I've never been able to find a copy of it to buy again, which is really annoying. Nope, nearly had it then, sort of related to Gnome. But anyway, it was an environmental, it was sort of like early 70s, and it was an environmental story where basically we'd been drilling for oil in the North Sea. And when you take something out of a gap, something must go in to replace that gap. So it all fills up with water. And water being more or less dense than oil meant that it seeps into the rock easier, and started pushing out these humanoid creatures out of the caves. And the idea was that humans, we all come from the same ancestor. And where we were coming back from an ape-like creature going into Homo sapien, there was a split at that point, and some went to live underground rather than above ground. So they became troglodyte. And they'd gone deep underground and lost their sight and had evolved to have very big wide fingers to get more feel against things. And because of the water now filling and flooding their homelands, they were coming out of the caves. And because they were coming out of the caves in a very Day of the Triffids kind of way, they actually had a disease that turned people blind, which didn't affect them because they were already blind, because they didn't need the eyesight for living in the dark. So they then became kind of like the other. They became the villain of the piece because we were forcing them out of their homeland into our land, and they were then starting to cause us problems with disease. So therefore they must be the problem themselves. So it had a kind of post-colonial and environmental message. And that kind of relates a little bit to this. Instead of them coming down from the sky on a meteor, if they talk about their land being dark and twilighty and almost sort of like the sun is almost a twinkle, it's almost like they were living underground and came out of a cave because they heard the sounds of the bells. They travelled too far away from their own home.
That would be an interesting side for it. Yeah, I mean, for me, I would want to sort of like start this story at the end, and I would have it as sort of like one of the characters has just turned 21 and is incredibly sick. The character name I've gone with is Kelly, just because Kelly Green. Yeah. It works for pigeonholing.
You could have gone with Sarah.
Yes, I could have done. Yeah. Anyway, the character turns 21, becomes very, very ill, and it means that we need some investigative character to sort of like backtrack through all of this and find out where they've come from. Almost as though we've got a Lovecraftian search for these troglodyte-style caves where things have been coming from.
I like that.
That way we can sort of like set it in libraries. We can sort of like have all your Lovecraftian characters bumping heads together, discussing various arcane themes.
Well, I particularly like the idea that if you have an older character that doesn't know where they came from, for example, there's that then relates to the stories of children that didn't know they were adopted until their parents died.
Yeah.
And then that's when they suddenly find out, or as sometimes happens, they don't find out they're adopted until they get sick later on in life, and then actually find out that they're not compatible with their parents whatsoever. They have a completely different blood group, and there's no matching at all. That's because they were adopted. So I like that idea. I think that aligns really nicely with a kind of a modern problem in that idea. So she gets sick of some variety, and nobody can understand why she's sick, and they can't treat her either because she's still, even though she's been living above ground all this time, there's certain parts of her body that haven't adapted to it. So you can look at the idea of evolution of humans at that point, and say where we've evolved to be above ground, what would be different evolving below ground?
Yes.
From a physiological point of view.
So that's going to mean that we've got obviously, with her being ill, that's a nice ticking bomb as well that's going along, because illness is going to mean that it's deteriorating, and we want her to be either recovering by the end of the story or with a solid recovery plan by the end of the story.
Yeah, but we want that jeopardy to come in that the person that goes off investigating, it isn't just about going through libraries. If you go down the Lovecraftian route, they've got to go through, doing that whole genealogical idea, finding and tracing the family tree, finding the story about where, she came from. So we might make her even a grandchild take it back a couple of generations.
Which would mean that we could then bring in an awful lot of backstory about these whole, this community of underground troglodytes. Yes.
Yeah. But also we can make her, her grandmother was the one that came out of the ground.
Right.
With her brother, and her brother died, and they were brought up in this little village community, so that her story becomes a couple of generations back in the folk tales. So then you get that kind of Angel Heart feel to it, or was it called Dark Angel? I think is the original novel.
What's Dark Angel?
Well, it got made into a film called Angel Heart, where a guy has to go and investigate. There's this guy called Lewis Cypher who hires an investigator. In the book, it's all set in New York, and in the film they go off to New Orleans. But he has virtually nothing. The guy's gone completely missing, and then Lewis Cypher hires the man to go and find him. So he's a private detective, and it's all that kind of like Sam Spade type investigative stuff that gets darker and deeper and weirder and more black magic orientated and sliced up black cockerels and all that kind of stuff, all the way to find out that the guy he's actually looking for is himself.
Right.
That he doesn't know who he is. And it's Lewis Cypher is Lucifer. And it's a deal that he did with the devil, and the devil's just come to collect the soul.
Right. We're definitely not going down that route, are we?
No. But what I mean is it's the way you can take things that go in much bigger steps. If you stay in libraries and stay with just like historical texts all the time, you kind of want the old woman in her 90s that remembers the old woman that died some 70 years before. And it was her that it kind of goes back to. So you almost create dead ends because of the age. And then something within that tale goes, everyone just doesn't take her seriously. And then what was I watching last night? I was watching, it was one of the ghost stories for Christmas that Mark Gatiss had adapted. M.R. James. It was like Martin, I think it was Martin Jones. Anyway, but that ends up with one of these where there's this piece of land that is known by this name, and it has this historical context that goes to it, where this piece of land apparently is where he drowned this woman and where he ended up getting executed. And of course, it's so many hundreds of years later, and the piece of land is still known by this name, but nobody really knows the story that goes with it. I quite like that idea of where it does deepen the urban legend. So you start off, a private investigator is hired because this woman is dying. The husband doesn't know her background. Husband hires the investigator who goes back and does a standard family search that only goes back 2 generations. And you're like, well, why does that happen? Where does this come from? So he goes to the area to try and find parish records. So he ends up in old dusty churches, and then finds this old story of 2 children that were found that leads him to another village, that then gets talking to this old woman that blicks the story, that takes him to an area that seems closed off, but then finds an entrance to a cave that is nicely hidden. And he's only following these little clues that nobody else has followed, that sort of thing. And then he ends up in the cave, and all the time he's phoning back and this woman's dying. So like you say, you've got the timings involved, but then he goes into the cave. So we start with the stranger comes to town, and then we go into him going over to the strange world.
Yes.
to where it goes. So we'll cover both those story elements in that. But when he goes down into this other world and then finds, you could go cosmic horror at that point in what he finds, but then finds that there are humans or humanoids down there where these two have come from, or, you know, where this woman's ancestry goes back to, but they are still there. They are living under the fear of these other creatures that are underneath the ground. And, you know, you can almost go cosmic horror. So he might come back with the answer, but completely insane. So nobody believes his story, but she survives.
I want to go a little bit Dennis Wheatley on this.
Okay.
When he's looking up the parish records,
Yeah.
he thinks he's found something, and then he's going to get somebody interfering and sort of like, somebody blocking his way, because these people who are the troglodytes, they've got people protecting their heritage and stopping people from looking into what's happening in their background.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So they are known about, but protected by kind of like a secret society.
Yes.
Yeah.
A society made up of both non-troglodytes and troglodytes, who sort of like have decided to work to keep the barrier between people. And I think, there should be the chance of a cure when we get through there, that their society is just as advanced as our society and has got sort of like treatments and things that they can apply to Kelly, who's poorly.
Yes.
So,
it'll be from the fauna, won't it? It'll be like they'll have different plant lives, mosses and fungus that they create their medicines from, and that would work with her. It would work with her part of that physiology.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I like that. That works.
So this is sort of like a story that's unraveling all the way down. But this hasn't even touched on horror yet, has it? This has become a mystery story.
Well, I think you know me, right? I think this actually sits in the line of the uncanny moving into the weird. I think it starts off as an uncanny story. So there is something slightly off kilter about it. So there is something, you know, she's not right. She's close to reality, but something just slightly off to give it that uncanny feel. And then within the investigation itself, it can then become those ideas of folklore, almost ghost story-esque in the way that things are talked about. And like you say, you then have the kind of secret society. But then when you go and cross over the threshold into the other world itself, it becomes a wonderment of horror. So everything is just much faster and more sort of like earth shattering when you get to the other side, and it becomes weird at that point. So there is still plenty of fear within it and terror. I think that's the thing I'm sort of getting to, is I think there's a lot of stuff that's just called mystery that is horror, you know. And I think it's once you start moving on to the idea of uncanny and weird is when it becomes true terror.
So you're talking about him moving over the threshold into this wonderment of horror. Are we talking about a threshold typically from Campbell's hero's journey? So this is sort of like a passage from the known and going definitely into the unknown, going into the abyss.
I'm yes and no. There is a certain amount of belly of the whale going on in the investigation, I think.
Right.
But I think this is definitely more Sid Field's 3-act structure, in that the point when he crosses over is very much the midpoint of the story. So you have the investigation that leads up to the discovery of the cave, and then you have a Volta that twists it round and it becomes that kind of second story, that Jules Verne style and H.P. Lovecraft style, going down into the bowels of the earth and finding a completely new and weird society down there. But then when he returns back, I think he's the one that ends up being the victim, because he comes back with the cure for her, but he's gone. He's completely ruined and destroyed, and nobody's going to believe a word he says. In fact, I mean, you could even find him as a gibbering wreck, and the only thing that they know is he's got this package on him, and he's managed to have enough wear about him to write on who it's for. So it gets to this woman, but nobody knows where he's been or where he got this package from, because he's completely and utterly lost his mind.
Yeah, I like it.
That works, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And him losing his mind is sort of like reinforcing the idea there are things that we should not know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I'm not sure if there are things that we should not know, but
Well, it's that kind of idea, isn't it? In that, oh, I can't remember who it said there are more things in heaven and earth than in people's imagination.
Hamlet.
Is it
There
in
are more
Hamlet?
things in heaven and hell than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio.
There you go, that one there. However, in saying that, that was Horatio's philosophy. That imagination was going on there. I think you'll find there's a number of us out there that can think of more things from heaven and hell. I like actually the heaven and hell allegory with this because that quite works as well. You can kind of write those connotations into it. You can go off and find some of the stories of hell. You can take Dante's levels of hell, for example, and not
Right.
be a complete parallel with, but you can almost sort of like say that these troglodytes have existed. Their evolution is parallel to our evolution. Like you say, they have medicines, very different looking sciences from us, but the same scientific method. They have tried things, they have experimented, they have found things that work, and they have continued to use those. So, but the evolutions have kind of gone parallel with each other, but one's been underground and one's been, on the ground, and or above ground and below ground. So that would be, a quite interesting parallel to sort of like almost try and write into it that the stories that we have of demons and devils and imps and all that kind of stuff are real. They are just other times where we have made communication with or happen to come across people from the underground.
Yeah, that would give it a nice layer of verisimilitude, wouldn't it, throughout it?
Well, I'll agree with that once I get hold of a dictionary.
It gives it a certain suggestion of truth because
Yes.
we're looking, yeah.
Mm. I mean, as you know, I'm really into metafiction, and I think that, and I like the idea of writing metafiction within itself as well. So if you create a universe and it has its set of rules, and in that universe it will then have its own literature, have its own arts, and have its own culture, so you can intertextualize within itself. And that's kind of what that does as well. It kind of it fulfills folklore prophecies effectively within itself, within its own rules.
No, I think that's an excellent story idea that we've got there. That really is, yeah. What are you thinking? Novel?
Well, don't know. I think the thing we've got to start with is, and this is where it's going to be quite interesting because I think this might be a project that we need to take out throughout the year and
Right.
keep coming back to it on here to say where we've got up to. We'll write this together, and then I think what we'll do is we'll we should write it in almost I don't know. What do you want to do? You want? I would say sort of probably chapter forms to go through, and then sort of like discuss those chapter forms that we've done when we've done them, and sort of like worked out how we'll write it together. So I would probably work with the idea of one of us writes the first draft and hands it over to the second to chapter by chapter, doing it that way.
Right.
Or we'll just write up a load of notes to start with, and then combine those into a central point of notes. So effectively, a bit like when we're doing the writer's room stuff. When we write scripts, we'll go off and write completely separate scenes. So one of us, if we work out where our chapter points need to be, we'll treat the whole thing, and then one writes one chapter and one writes the other chapter. And then we bring them together, and then we just do an overall edit across the two that then sort of like pieces them together and creates that singular voice between the two of them. That works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we'll release it.
Yeah, don't worry about story length either. It can be as long as it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's very important. We do a lot of short story stuff on here, and it might even be a case of, I don't know, maybe sort of like try and start it with a short story as a nice treatment of it, because you can start it almost on media res, couldn't you? Because you could come in at the point where the detective's been hired, so
Right.
he can give information backwards. So obviously, first person sat in his hotel room wondering why on earth he's taken on the case. and he can then just talk about almost diary form where he's got to in that point without it going into too much detail. And he's now sat in this village where he's found this piece of information, and then write that middle section investigation going into the underground. I mean, that wouldn't work with the end. That's not the style that would work with the end, because you'd have to be in third person to make the end work, I think.
Yeah, I think so as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going something like, was it Flowers for Algernon? Or, yeah, there's a couple of stories where you've got your first narrator lapsing into obvious signs of mental dysfunction or discord, but again, that's sort of like, seems like an easy ploy. And
yeah, I mean, I think when you start doing that, you've got to be very careful in how you bring it in. I think, one of the greatest components of that is yellow wallpaper, isn't it? Where she just completely slides into madness, and by whatever means. But
third person.
Sorry?
And also into third person.
Yes. But that becomes part of her madness, doesn't it? She almost starts referring to herself in the third person, and that works. But it's a very short, and very hard hitting story. I think if you try to elongate that, it would start losing its power. So I think maybe a third person narrative would work better on this one. And maybe even actually, what about the Dracula idea of several different journals? Which is also, when you think about it, the H.P. Lovecraft idea as well, because a lot of the Cthulhu stuff was written in journals.
Yeah. Yeah. I 100% like that.
So you can work out which characters need to write which journals. So her husband can write the first journals about how she's ill.
Yeah.
And then you have the journals of the private investigator, and then you have the parish records. So you can write it as a folk story, as a completely separate short story, as a folk story.
Yeah. Yes, like that.
So where I would start with that would be writing the legend.
Right. I think where I would start with it would be her husband complaining about the lack of proper medical attention and care that's been given when his wife suddenly turns green and starts, yeah.
That's it. Well, that's the first part of it, isn't it? Her skin starts turning green.
Yeah, and sort of like, doctors are doing fuck all about it because
she has a genetic throwback to her troglodyte ancestry, which requires a certain mineral in her body that she's deficient in.
Yeah. Yeah. Silly cow decided to go vegan, and this is the upshot of it.
Or she just stopped eating mushrooms, which I like the idea of, because the one thing that does link the above to the below is the mycelium network.
Right.
So there's a lot of really interesting stuff with the mycelium network. It takes all the carbon out of trees. They've actually proved now that the trees do actually communicate with each other through the mycelium network and stuff like that. They don't say, run away, or anything like that, but they do actually communicate. And so they've found that trees do understand where there are areas of light and dark and things like that going on because of the mycelium network, and everything grows out of that effectively. So that's a really nice link between the above and the below.
Definitely, yeah.
And then if you start taking that out of the equation, so she starts getting this deficiency, and all it has to be is a throwback. We've all seen it. We all have them, don't we? There's various genetic disorders that people have that are a throwback that can skip many generations.
Yeah.
So this particular disorder, which never manifested in the previous generations because it skipped generations, has just sort of like manifested in her. And that's why it's, and it is a deficiency for this particular fungus that grows underground. There you go. There's your medical bit sorted.
Yeah. Yes.
and the doctors wouldn't know it. They wouldn't understand why it's happening.
No, so we've got our character who's in distress. What's the private investigator going to be like?
Well, there's always the temptation to make a private investigator a womanizing alcoholic, because we've all read the like Sam Spade type ones. We all like the idea of a woman walking in and she rolled her eyes at me, type of investigator. I think I actually like the idea of him being very quintessentially British. So he's quite a shy man.
Right.
And not Dennis Wick. Dennis Weakley was always gentrified in the way that he did things. There's always a superior intellect. Where I quite like the idea of him being a bit more officious, a bit more detectorist in the way that he does things. He's more of a historian. That's why he kind of gets involved in it. He sort of does these. He does these private investigations and all that sort of stuff. But he's never done anything like this before. He normally investigates missing parents, or actually, what would be an interesting thing is where the reason he gets phoned is he does offer a service where he goes looking for parents of adopted children that want to find their parents.
Right.
So he is a little bit not caring on the emotional side of things. He thinks he's doing good, but not necessarily always doing good. It's not always the wisest thing to do, but that's why he knows about going into parish records and genealogies and all that kind of stuff. He gets hired by people to find ancestry type work. So he's happy at home with his books.
So happy at home with his books, quintessentially British. Who's our villain?
Who's the antagonist in this? Well, I'm going to say that the antagonist is going to come a bit later, isn't it? The antagonist is going to be the group that's protecting the troglodytes.
Right.
Okay.
So this is the group that's meant to be neutral, who are meant to be sort of like an impartial barrier between our world and their world. But it's governed by somebody who wants to keep that barrier in place.
There's this whole thing, isn't there, where we always joke about it with animal rights, where they're quite happy for 20 scientists to die in an explosion as long as all the lab animals get out.
Yeah.
So I kind of see it as a bit like that, in that at absolute all costs, they mustn't communicate or mustn't come together because it will destroy their beautiful, perfect community that they have underground. And that's how this person sees it. This person sees them as untouched by modern technology. It's the person who's trying to protect the tribe in the middle of the Amazon, and not sort of like go, well, actually there's stuff that would really help them. Go, no, that's how they've lived for the last 100,000 years. That's how they must always continue to live. And there's this blindness to their conviction that is as harmful as it is protective.
Yeah, don't you dare give them penicillin. Don't you dare make them problems. Yeah, they don't need our hateful technology. Yes.
So that's the way I kind of see it, as kind of like it's going to automatically have an environmental message in this. I think there's no way you can do it without it appearing within it. But I quite like the idea of the environmental message still staying there, but the one that's trying to be very environmentalist is the protagonist. No, an antagonist, I should say. They're being over the top with it. They are the villain of the piece because they think they're trying to keep the peace.
Yes, I like that. I like that a lot. Definitely.
So that gives you. So you've got the woman who's got green screen mushrooms. Okay. And she'll have breathing difficulties and her eyesight will be going, all the stuff that's effectively she's just turning back into, that particular part of the evolution. Yeah, the troglodyte.
Yeah.
Then you've got the investigator who's just sort of like very timid, not a people person. So he really doesn't suffer people. Books are better than people. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he's gonna be slightly unhinged, but you're not really gonna know that until later on, because there's got to be a reason. I don't really go for this whole flicker switch into madness type thing, which H.P. Lovecraft used to do quite often. To look at it is to go mad, that kind of. I sometimes think it's a bit of a cop out. That I quite like the slightly, keeps himself to himself because he's spoken about things in the past and people don't believe him, so. He's always been viewed a little bit like that. So when he does finally crack and go mental, then people don't look at him and go, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that." It was kind of like something that people thought was bound to happen sooner or later.
Yes. If people were honest enough to admit that, because usually people sort of like, "Oh no, never expected that Dennis Nielsen to be a serial killer."
Yes.
But Dharma, yeah, he seemed ever so nice, yeah.
Yeah. And it is that whole kind of thing. It's like, if I ever had another breakdown, a complete psychotic dismantling of my reality, I like to think that most people would be expecting it to happen at some point rather than be completely surprised that it happened. It's that kind of, well, if you read his books, you'll understand why he went like this, that sort of thing.
Right, so we've got the main characters. Supporting cast will be easy enough to populate that. Location.
Well, do we go completely balls out on the inspiration and make it the Green Children of Woolpit?
Why the fuck not?
So set it in Suffolk.
Right.
Yeah. We might even go down to Suffolk for the day. Wherever it is. I don't even know where it is.
Is it just a little bit further down from Norfolk, or am I being stupid there?
I'll find out. Are they the ones that have a really funny county council?
Oh my God, there it is. Right. Oh, they've got a car boot sale on. Oh, no, they haven't.
Oh, yes, it's over Cambridge, just down from Norwich, Ipswich, that sort of area, isn't it?
Let's see.
Over East Anglia way, M11.
Bury St Edmunds.
Looks about 2.5, 3 hours.
Jesus, you're nearly Ipswich by that point, aren't you?
Yep. Oh, I think Ipswich is in Suffolk.
God. You're actually on a par with the Netherlands there and The Hague.
Oh, it's 4 hours, 26 minutes. Guys, it's just...
Bloody hell.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe we won't do a day in Suffolk.
No.
That would require an overnight at 4 hours and a bit. I can't do there and back in 9 hours anymore.
No, I'm of exactly the same mindset. Right, so we know the location, though. We know where the story's set. Good.
Yeah. So if we set it over there, so we need to do plenty of research on the area.
Right.
So that we can get that idea sort of going. More research, which you've already done. So you already know a couple of podcasts into the Green Children of Woolpit. And let's get some research going on there. That will give us that area. So that's kind of like our middle ground, isn't it? When he starts going into the area and we can pinpoint a number of villages over there that he can actually travel through to get to that particular point. And so, what about the woman's husband? Are we just going to shall we make him unreasonable? Like one of your Karens? Or is that too much of a cliche to have an unreasonable husband?
I think he needs to be reasonable. He's sort of like trying to chase up, he's concerned for his wife and he's going to employ a private investigator. And I think anybody who's going to do that needs to have some level of reasonableness about them, because that's part of money. Yeah.
When Steven Spielberg makes the film of this, we can let him change him to a more nefarious character at that point, I think. But yeah, so I think, I mean, they're going to have to be, he's not going to be working class, is he? I quite like the idea of her coming through the working class. Why does she end up where she is? And, obviously, because he can hire a private investigator, he's definitely going to be more well off.
Yeah.
To be able to do that. But I think because when you think about it, her great grandmother is going to have come out of a village I'm not saying that people in villages are naturally working class, but what about that? What about sort of like giving her a more working class roots?
Yeah, that works. Yeah, I thought you
Yeah.
were going to say people from villages are inbred.
No, no. Cakes, maybe. They might be in cakes.
No, I think well,
Or how about the PI? PI would be an ideal. Just so we've got a working class protagonist.
do you think that's important for the story?
I think it could be, yeah. I think it can work in terms of one of the reasons he's not taken so seriously in his other works, which is why he kind of sort of like isn't so much of a people person.
Like it? Yes, definitely.
Mm.
Yes. Right, yeah, I'm ready to go on this one then.
Brilliant. Right then, title will come later. What do you want? Do you have an idea for a working title?
We'll go with the Green Man just for a working title.
The Green Kids.
Green Kids, yes. Yes.
Green Kids. Start off with that. Or Mushroom Miners, one of them.
No, that works.
Yeah. So that's just a working title. That will change. So what we'll do is we will convene on this. We'll convene on this next month in February. We will come back to this and say, right, where are we up to with the project at the moment, and where's it got up to? And we'll discuss the bits we've got written and the treatment areas that we've got done. And so throughout the course of this project, as it goes on, we will keep coming back on and doing another kind of half hour, 40 minutes chat about where we're up to, what we've discovered. Because sometimes, as Ash will, be testament to, is you start on these research things and you end up going down a research black hole that you find the most interesting things to add to the story that you never realize were there. When you start doing things like researching mushrooms, for example, I'm going to have plenty of fun researching mushrooms to find the right kind of fungus that goes with the story. But it's and you'll say that, won't you, actually? Would you agree there that when you start going down these routes, you find the most beautiful little bits of other folk tales that seem to marry in, or other fairy tales that you can then just reference all the way down, and you can spend 3 weeks absolutely writing nothing and just listening to podcasts and reading the latest book that you found.
At least a few weeks, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So, and then actually, I think we're going to get to a point where we'll decide whether it's going to be a novel, because I've started swinging back towards radio plays again recently, and I think it's because when I go to do my MA, I'm going to specialise in radio plays. So this might end up being a book and a radio play, and just something that we can just write. And then I'll get some people together and record it and all that kind of stuff. But we shall see. We'll see where it takes us, into which form it will grow into.
Brilliant. Yeah, looking forward to working on it.
That is fantastic. Right, so that in mind, remember we're not going to be talking about this next week. What do you want to do next week?
Do you want to read a story?
Yeah. Are we going to go with another old story, or do you want to do something a bit more modern, as in someone who isn't a story that isn't published yet?
Who were you thinking?
Well, we're both members of the Blackpool Horror Society.
Yeah.
And I know that Elaine Ridgway, who is developing, she's got this project on the go at the moment, which is going to be an amazing travel book, but she's also written some incredible stories on that. So I'm thinking what we should do is today, because I'm actually seeing her later, I'll ask her to present one of her stories.
Right.
I'll record it as an audio. She needs to understand that that's going to be first publication. So whatever story she gives us, we're going to end up doing first publication on it.
Right.
I'll then record it as an audio to put up on our reading list, and then we'll discuss that next week.
Perfect.
Does that sound like a plan?
Perfect.
Superb. Right. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this today. This has been absolutely magnificent.
Likewise, really, really looking forward to getting on with this one. Yeah.
Yes. Cool. All right then. Well, until next time when we'll be reading something very, very new. Have a great week, Ash.
Hasta la vista.
Baby.
Okay,
See you
mate.
later. Bye.